High Commander Zixtal's primary sensory appendages twitched violently as he stared at the holographic battle report floating before him. His secondary brain was already calculating the political fallout, while his primary consciousness struggled to process the sheer magnitude of Strategic Commander Rex's blunder. With all due respect, High Commander, Rex's tendrils rippled in what passed for a dismissive gesture among their kind. They're barely a Class 3 civilization. The humans had no right establishing settlements in hegemony space. The cleansing operation was perfectly within protocol. Protocol? Zixtal's epidermis shifted to a deep purple of rage. You obliterated an entire colony of 50,000 souls without warning because they were technically 3 light-years inside an arbitrary border they didn't even know existed. Have you completely lost your neural functions? They're primitives, Rek insisted, his own skin taking on the mottled green of stubborn certainty. They still use chemical rockets for local transport, for Void's sake. Their most advanced weapons are crude kinetic accelerators and nuclear devices. The Empire has nothing to fear from... The rest of his statement was cut off by the sudden blaring of emergency alerts across every console in the command center. Zixtal's third eye swiveled to the nearest display, where a priority message was scrolling across the screen. Alert. Massive energy signature detected. Origin. Sol system. Human homeworld. Classification. Unknown. Exceeds all known parameters. What in the eternal void? Zixtal muttered, before the main view screen automatically activated to show them exactly what was happening. The image made both commanders' respiratory systems temporarily shut down in shock. Humanity's response to the colony massacre was being broadcast across every frequency, in every language the hegemony used, and even in formats they'd never seen before. The message was simple, elegant, and absolutely terrifying. We were trying to be nice. That was it. 3 cycles later, the reports started coming in. The humans, it seemed, had not been entirely forthcoming about their technological capabilities. As Rek would later reflect, from his cell awaiting trial for catastrophic incompetence, perhaps judging a species' advancements solely by their visible infrastructure hadn't been the wisest approach. The first sign that something was catastrophically wrong came when 3 hegemony border outposts simply ceased to exist. No debris, no radiation signature, no distress call. One moment they were there, the next they weren't. The space they had occupied showed signs of what the science division would later term localized reality discontinuity. It turned out that humanity had mastered quantum mechanics to a degree that made the hegemony's understanding look like a child's puzzle cube. They hadn't been using chemical rockets because they were primitive. They'd been using them because they were quaint. Like how some humans still rode horses for fun. The real human fleet emerged from what could only be described as tears in the fabric of space-time itself. Their ships didn't show up on any sensors because they weren't entirely there in any conventional sense. They existed in a state that made conventional matter look crude and simplistic by comparison. Well, Zixtal said as he watched the reports flood in, each worse than the last. At least now we know why they confined themselves to such primitive technology in their visible operations. He turned all 3 eyes to Rek, who was attempting to make himself as small as possible in the corner of the command center. They were trying not to frighten us. The human ships, if they could even be called ships, didn't bother with anything as pedestrian as weapons. They simply adjusted local physics in ways that made hegemony technology stop working. Or exist. Or both. The science division's reports became increasingly incoherent as they tried to explain what they were observing. One particularly memorable report simply read, "They're not breaking the laws of physics. They're politely asking physics to step aside for a moment, and physics is complying out of sheer embarrassment." The humans had apparently been watching their neighbors for centuries, carefully maintaining a technological facade that wouldn't trigger any nervous reactions. They'd been perfectly happy to play the role of the promising but primitive species, gradually developing their technology at a pace that wouldn't alarm anyone. They'd even deliberately created a colony using only primitive technology, staffed by volunteers who were willing to live without their more advanced capabilities, all in an effort to establish peaceful first contact with the hegemony at a level that wouldn't trigger diplomatic incidents, and Rek had gone and vaporized it. "You know what the worst part is?" Zixtal said, watching another battle group vanish from existence with the same effort he might use to swat an insect. "They're still trying to be nice. Notice how they're only targeting military installations? How there hasn't been a single civilian casualty?" A junior communications officer spoke up from her station, her scales a pale yellow of nervous confusion. "High Commander, we're receiving a transmission from the human fleet. They're requesting diplomatic channels? They say they'd like to discuss terms for a cessation of hostilities. Zixtal couldn't help but laugh. It wasn't a happy sound. They're kicking our primary excretory orifices across 13 star systems with technology we can't even properly detect, much less counter. And they're asking us if we'd like to talk about peace terms. The humans, it seemed, were pathologically reasonable. Even now, after suffering an unprovoked attack that killed 50,000 of their people, they were still trying to resolve things diplomatically. It was somehow more terrifying than if they'd simply gone on a rampage of revenge. The message continued. We understand that this was the action of a single commander acting outside proper authority. We are prepared to discuss reparations and establish proper diplomatic relations, provided that those responsible are held accountable and measures are put in place to prevent future incidents. They're not even demanding territory or technology, the communications officer noted, her scales shifting to a confused blend of colors. Just basic diplomatic recognition and justice for their people? Zixtal finally understood what he was seeing. This wasn't just a display of overwhelming military superiority. It was a lesson. The humans had revealed just enough of their true capabilities to make it clear that they could have conquered the hegemony at any time, but had chosen not to. They'd rather be neighbors than conquerors. The fact that they could be this reasonable while simultaneously demonstrating the ability to casually ignore the fundamental laws of physics made them more intimidating, not less. What kind of species achieved that level of power and chose to use it with such restraint? Send a response, Zixtal ordered, all three eyes fixed on the main display where another hegemony battle group had just learned the hard way about humanity's true capabilities. Tell them I am authorized to begin immediate diplomatic negotiations on behalf of the hegemony, and that Commander Rek is already in custody awaiting trial. He paused, then added, and include a formal apology. Make it clear that we understand the magnitude of our error and are prepared to make appropriate restitution. As the message was sent, Zixtal found himself wondering about something that hadn't occurred to him before. If this was humanity being nice, what would they be capable of if they actually got angry? He very much hoped the hegemony would never find out. The response came almost immediately. We accept your opening position and look forward to productive discussions. As a gesture of good faith, we are standing down our quantum displacement fleet. Normal space-time will resume in affected areas within the next few hours. We suggest beginning our talks by establishing proper borders and communication protocols to prevent future misunderstandings. Zixtal felt his scales shift to the deep blue of relief tinged with lingering anxiety. Send confirmation of our agreement, he ordered. And someone get me every record we have on human diplomatic customs. I want to make sure we don't accidentally offend them during negotiations. As his staff scrambled to comply, Zixtal made a mental note to update the hegemony's classification protocols. Clearly, judging a species' capabilities solely by their visible technology was a dangerously flawed approach. Sometimes, it seemed, the most advanced civilizations were the ones wise enough to hide their power until absolutely necessary. The humans had taught the hegemony a valuable lesson about assumptions and appearances. They'd also demonstrated that being technologically superior didn't mean you had to be cruel or unreasonable. In fact, their restraint and continued dedication to diplomatic solutions even after being attacked spoke volumes about their character as a species. In the cycles that followed, as diplomatic relations were established and reparations arranged, a saying began to circulate among hegemony diplomatic corps. If you need to show your power to prove you have it, you probably don't have as much as you think. The humans, it turned out, had never needed to prove anything. They'd been content to let everyone think they were still working on basic spaceflight while they had apparently mastered the art of asking the universe itself to redirect traffic. And somehow that made them even more impressive. Years later, during a diplomatic function celebrating the 10th anniversary of formal relations between humanity and the hegemony, Zixtal, now serving as ambassador to Earth, found himself sharing a drink with a human diplomatic officer. You know, the human said, swirling some amber liquid in a glass, we really were trying to do things the gentle way. That colony was supposed to be our way of showing we could play nice with the neighbors. I've always wondered, Zixtal admitted, his scales shifting to the pearl white of diplomatic curiosity. Why did you maintain the pretense for so long? Surely you knew about us centuries ago. The human smiled. We did, but Mom always said if you're going to move into a new neighborhood, it's polite to introduce yourself gradually. Not everyone appreciates having their paradigms shifted without warning. Zixtal's third eye swiveled to focus on the human, while the other two maintained proper diplomatic positioning. And the quantum displacement fleet? Was that really necessary? Oh, that? The human's smile widened just a fraction. That was just what we had lying around in storage. We figured it would be impolite to bring out the really interesting stuff for such a minor disagreement. Zixtal felt his scales shift involuntarily to the pale yellow of nervous realization. Storage? Minor disagreement? You mean you have more? Oh yes. The human took another sip of their drink. But don't worry about it. We're neighbors now, and good neighbors respect each other's boundaries. More brandy? Zixtal accepted the drink and made a mental note to update the diplomatic advisory again. When dealing with humans, always remember, their politeness is not a sign of weakness, but rather a courtesy they extend to those who haven't yet given them a reason to be impolite. And hope you never have to find out what impolite looks like. So you're telling me they can do what with black holes? Ambassador Zixtal's scales rippled through several shades of disbelief as he stared at the classified report. The human diplomatic attaché, Sarah Chen, maintained her pleasantly neutral expression, though he could have sworn there was a glimmer of amusement in her eyes. We don't actually do anything with them, Ambassador, she explained, taking another sip of her tea. We simply engage in polite discourse with the quantum foam underlying spacetime and occasionally request the temporary loan of a micro-singularity or two. They're quite accommodating once you learn how to ask nicely. The diplomatic function had moved from the formal reception hall to one of the smaller meeting rooms in the Earth Embassy, where various dignitaries from both species were engaged in what humans called casual networking. Zixtal was beginning to suspect that these informal gatherings were where the real diplomatic work happened. But the energy requirements alone would be, he began, before trailing off as Sarah gently shook her head. You're still thinking in terms of conventional physics, she said. We found it's much more efficient to just have a pleasant chat with the fundamental forces and come to an agreeable arrangement. Zixtal's third eye swiveled to focus on a group of junior hegemony diplomats who were being introduced to something called ice cream by their human counterparts. Their scales were cycling through colors of surprise, delight, and mild brain freeze. Is that why we never detected any significant energy signatures from your research facilities? He asked, pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. You weren't actually using energy in the conventional sense? Precisely, Sarah nodded. Though I should mention that this conversation is technically classified under Section 7 of our treaty. We're only having it because you've achieved the necessary diplomatic clearance level. A thought occurred to Zixtal. The quantum displacement fleet. That wasn't actually a fleet, was it? Sarah's smile widened fractionally. Oh, those were real ships. We maintain them for situations that require a more traditional approach. But you're right. The actual displacement effect was just us asking local spacetime if it wouldn't mind taking a brief coffee break in certain areas. A coffee break? Zixtal repeated slowly, his scales shifting to a peculiar shade that didn't quite have a name in either species' language. You convinced the fundamental fabric of reality to take a break? Well, we did offer it coffee first, Sarah said with perfect seriousness. It would be rather rude not to. Before Zixtal could process the implications of reality itself apparently being susceptible to human hospitality, one of his aides hurried over with an urgent message. The aide's scales were flickering between anxiety and confusion, never a good combination. Ambassador, we're receiving reports from the Arcturian border, the aide said, trying to maintain diplomatic composure. The swarm has begun another expansion push. 3 systems have already gone dark. The swarm. Even humans spoke the name with a certain gravity. They were the only species known to have rejected all attempts at diplomatic contact, existing solely to consume and expand. The hegemony had lost 17 systems to them in the last Great War 2 centuries ago. But Sarah's expression hadn't changed. If anything, she looked mildly annoyed, like someone who'd just been reminded of an overdue library book. Ah yes, she said, checking something on her comm device. We were wondering when they'd make their move. Would the hegemony be interested in a joint peacekeeping operation? We have some ideas about encouraging the swarm to consider a more diplomatic approach to existence. Zixtal's scales shifted rapidly through several colors before settling on a deep purple of realization. You knew they were coming? Of course, Sarah replied, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. We've been monitoring them since we first achieved quantum awareness. They're actually quite interesting from a philosophical perspective. A species that evolved to reject the very concept of cooperation. We've been working on ways to help them see the benefits of diplomatic discourse. Help them, Zixtal's primary brain nearly shut down trying to process the implications. The swarm has destroyed every species that's attempted contact. They've consumed entire sectors of space. How exactly do you plan to help them? Sarah's smile took on a quality that made Zixtal very glad humans were inclined toward diplomacy. We thought we'd start by having a firm but polite conversation with their fundamental molecular bonds. Perhaps suggest that aggressive expansion isn't the most productive use of their existence. You're going to reason with their molecular structure? Well, we find it's best to start at the basics when attempting cultural exchange, Sarah explained, as if discussing nothing more complex than a dinner menu. If we can convince their constituent particles to consider a more cooperative approach to reality, the rest should follow naturally. Zixtal was saved from having to respond to this casual rearrangement of his understanding of reality by the arrival of more human diplomats, each carrying what appeared to be data pads, but which, he now suspected, might actually be interfaces for communicating with the cosmic background radiation. Sarah, one of the newcomers said, the Quantum Ethics Committee has approved the proposal for the swarm intervention. They suggest starting with a gentle reminder about the benefits of entropy optimization through cooperative existence. Excellent, Sarah replied. Ambassador Zixtal, would the hegemony be interested in sending observers? We believe in full transparency with our allies, and this could be an educational experience for your quantum physics division. Zixtal found himself agreeing before his primary brain had fully processed the request. His secondary brain, however, was already composing a message to the Hegemony Science Council suggesting they completely reorganize their understanding of physics to include the possibility that the universe might be susceptible to peer pressure. As he watched the humans casually discuss their plans to essentially talk an unstoppable cosmic horror into being more sociable, Zixtal couldn't help but wonder if there was something in Earth's water that made its inhabitants so casually reality-breaking while remaining unfailingly polite about it. Oh, and Ambassador, Sarah added, almost as an afterthought. Would you like to see our garden? We've been having the most fascinating conversations with photosynthesis lately. It has some rather innovative ideas about renewable energy. Zixtal decided that some mysteries of human civilization were perhaps better left unexplored. But he accepted the invitation anyway. After all, it would be impolite to decline. And if there was one thing he'd learned about humans, it was that politeness mattered. Especially when dealing with a species that could apparently convince the laws of physics to take coffee breaks. Would anyone care for more tea before we begin the quantum restructuring? Dr. Elena Martinez, Earth's leading quantum diplomatist, stood at the front of the observation deck aboard the HMS Reasonable Discussion. Behind her, through the massive viewport, the roiling mass of the swarm's main fleet stretched across several light-years of space, a writhing darkness that consumed everything in its path. Ambassador Zixtal, along with a delegation of hegemony scientists, watched in fascinated horror as the humans prepared for what they insisted on calling a neighborly chat with an entity that had devoured civilizations. I still don't understand, Professor Kalax, the hegemony's foremost expert on quantum mechanics, admitted. His scales had been stuck in a particularly unusual shade of confused purple for the past 3 hours. How exactly do you plan to communicate with their molecular structure? Oh, it's quite straightforward, Elena replied, adjusting what looked like a perfectly ordinary teacup, but which, Zixtal suspected, probably contained something far more exotic than Earl Grey. We've found that quantum fields respond quite well to proper etiquette. It's all about establishing the right tone for the conversation. On the main display, status readouts showed the swarm continuing its inexorable advance toward the inhabited systems of the Arcturus sector. Traditional sensors registered their numbers in the billions, living ships that consumed everything in their path to produce more of themselves. Beginning quantum diplomatic overture, announced one of the human technicians, who was typing on what appeared to be a normal keyboard, but which Zixtal had learned was actually an interface for communicating with subatomic particles. Initiating polite conversation with their fundamental wave functions. The hegemony delegation watched in stunned silence as the humans essentially began having tea with reality itself. Elena took a sip from her cup and somehow, impossibly, the quantum readings from the swarm began to change. Now you see, Elena explained casually, as civilization-ending horrors began to inexplicably pause in their advance. The problem with the swarm isn't that they're inherently hostile. They simply never learned proper quantum etiquette. Their wave functions are terribly antisocial. Professor Kalax's scales shifted to the pale yellow of scientific distress. Are you suggesting that the swarm's behavior is the result of poor quantum manners? Precisely. Elena beamed at him. Their fundamental particles never learned to play nicely with others. But we're helping them understand the benefits of cooperative quantum states. Through the viewport, the swarm's vast fleet had completely stopped moving. Individual ships appeared to be vibrating in unusual ways, as if their very atoms were engaged in serious contemplation. "Would you look at that?" one of the human technicians remarked. "Their quantum spin states are already showing signs of increased social awareness. I think they're beginning to understand the concept of personal space." A junior hegemony scientist, whose scales had been cycling through various shades of disbelief, finally found their voice. But the energy requirements for this kind of manipulation would be— "Oh, we're not manipulating anything," Elena interrupted gently. "We're just having a conversation. Would you like to see the transcript? It's quite fascinating. Their quarks are particularly eloquent once you get them talking about cooperative existence." Before anyone could respond to this casual violation of everything they thought they knew about physics, alarms began blaring across the ship. The swarm was changing. Where before there had been a chaotic mass of destructive force, patterns were beginning to emerge. The living ships were reorganizing themselves, not into attack formations, but into what looked almost like— "Are they forming a conference table?" Zixtal asked in disbelief. "Well, they need somewhere to sit for the negotiations," Elena replied, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "It would be terribly rude to discuss terms of existence without proper seating arrangements." The main display was now showing readings that made several hegemony scientists need to sit down. The swarm's fundamental structure was reorganizing itself on a quantum level, apparently in response to nothing more than a polite suggestion from the humans. "Now," Elena said, producing what looked suspiciously like a plate of cookies, "who would like to join me in welcoming our new neighbors to the diplomatic community? Their electron shells have expressed particular interest in learning about cultural exchange." Professor Kalax raised a trembling appendage. "Are those actual cookies?" "Of course," Elena smiled. "Though the recipe has been quantum optimized for cross-dimensional palatability. We found that sharing refreshments helps establish a proper foundation for diplomatic relations, even at the subatomic level." Through the viewport, the swarm continued its impossible transformation. What had once been a force of mindless destruction was reorganizing itself into something that looked increasingly like a proper diplomatic delegation, albeit one composed of billions of previously murderous living ships. "Remarkable," one of the human technicians noted, checking their readings. "Their quantum coherence patterns are already showing signs of developing a formal diplomatic protocol. I think they're trying to decide what to wear to the reception." "The reception?" Zixtal managed to ask. "Oh yes," Elena replied cheerfully. "We always host a proper welcome reception for new members of the diplomatic community." The quantum foam simply insisted. It's apparently quite fond of party planning. As the hegemony delegation tried to process the idea of fundamental forces of nature having opinions about social events, Elena turned to address the viewport directly. "Now then," she said, somehow managing to address billions of quantum-reformed space horrors with the same tone one might use at a neighborhood gathering. "Shall we discuss the benefits of cooperative existence over tea? We have several lovely blends that I think your newly socialized quantum states might enjoy." The swarm, impossibly, responded by reconfiguring a small portion of itself into what appeared to be an elegant tea service. "You see," Elena said to the stunned observers, "good manners really do make all the difference, even at the quantum level." Zixtal made a mental note to update the hegemony's diplomatic protocols yet again. Apparently they needed a section on proper tea etiquette when dealing with reformed cosmic horrors. He also couldn't help but wonder if there was anything in the universe that humans couldn't solve with a properly conducted diplomatic discussion. Though he had to admit, watching a former civilization-ending threat learn about the proper way to serve scones, that their methods were effective, if utterly bewildering. "Oh, and Ambassador," Elena added, "the quantum foam would like to know if you have any dietary restrictions for the reception. It's very keen on being an accommodating host." Zixtal decided that some questions were better left unasked, like how exactly the quantum foam had developed an interest in catering, or why he was suddenly craving tea. "And now, if you'll direct your attention to the quantum harmonics display, you'll see that the swarm's civilization has developed a particularly fascinating appreciation for Baroque architecture." Dr. Elena Martinez stood before the assembled Galactic Council, 1 month after the historic quantum diplomatic intervention. Behind her, holographic displays showed the transformed swarm systems, where billions of once murderous living ships had reorganized themselves into elaborate structures that somehow managed to blend biological horror with surprisingly elegant artistic sensibilities. Ambassador Zixtal, now serving as the hegemony's representative to the newly expanded council, watched with a mixture of awe and residual anxiety as Elena presented the results of what humans were calling Project Good Neighbor. As you can see, Elena continued, gesturing to a particularly impressive construction that looked like a Gothic cathedral designed by someone with a profound appreciation for non-Euclidean geometry. Their quantum states have developed a remarkable affinity for cultural expression. We believe this is a natural outcome of their newfound understanding of cooperative existence. And they're stable? Asked the Rigelian ambassador, all 7 of their eye stalks focused intently on the display. There's no risk of regression to their former behavioral patterns? Oh, quite stable, Elena assured them, taking a sip from her ever-present teacup. Once quantum particles understand the benefits of proper social interaction, they rarely desire to return to antisocial behaviors. The swarm's fundamental forces have become quite enthusiastic about community engagement. As if to emphasize her point, the main display shifted to show what appeared to be a massive structure composed of former swarm ships, arranged in what could only be described as a galaxy-scale community center. They're particularly proud of their new cultural exchange program, Elena noted. Their quantum fields have been hosting fascinating discussions with various space-time phenomena. Last week, they had a lovely symposium with a group of particularly philosophical black holes. The council chamber erupted in murmured discussions, translated through dozens of universal translators that the humans had thoughtfully upgraded to handle quantum diplomatic terminology. Dr. Martinez? The Centaurian representative began, their crystalline form vibrating with curiosity. Are you suggesting that the swarm, a force that once threatened to consume all known civilizations, is now organizing educational seminars? Among other things, Elena nodded. They've discovered quite a passion for teaching. It turns out that when you convince quantum particles to embrace cooperation, they become rather eager to share their insights. Their lecture series on ethical applications of hive mind consciousness has been particularly well received. Zixtal's scales shifted to a new shade that his species had recently developed specifically to express amazement at human quantum diplomacy. And the theoretical physics courses they're offering? Oh yes, Elena brightened. Those have been wonderful, though we did have to have a gentle conversation with them about not accidentally rewriting local physics during their more enthusiastic demonstrations. They're still learning about dimensional etiquette. The council chamber's quantum monitoring systems chose that moment to register an unusual spike. On the main display, a portion of what had once been the swarm's invasion fleet had reconfigured itself into what appeared to be... Is that a quantum art gallery? The Rigelian ambassador asked, eye stalks swaying in disbelief. Indeed, Elena confirmed. They've become quite passionate about expressing higher dimensional concepts through creative reconfiguration of their quantum states. The exhibition you're seeing is titled Reflections on Cooperative Existence, a Multi-Dimensional Perspective. We're particularly impressed with their use of quantum entanglement as a metaphor for community bonds. A junior human diplomat leaned over to whisper something in Elena's ear. She nodded and turned back to the council. I've just been informed that the swarm's newly formed cultural committee would like to formally request permission to host the next Galactic Arts Festival. They're proposing a theme of unity through quantum harmony, a celebration of cooperative reality. The council chamber fell silent as its members attempted to process the image of former cosmic horrors organizing an arts festival. Zixtal found himself wondering if perhaps the humans' approach to diplomacy wasn't so much about changing others, as it was about helping them discover better versions of themselves. We've also been invited, Elena continued, seemingly oblivious to the collective existential crisis she was causing, to the opening of their new Quantum Ethics Research Institute. They're particularly excited about their upcoming symposium on responsible reality manipulation, a framework for multidimensional citizenship. The Arcturian ambassador, whose species had lost several colonies to the swarm in the past, raised an appendage. And they're apologetic about their previous behavior? Oh, extremely, Elena assured them. They've established quite an extensive reparations program. Their quantum states were quite mortified when they realized how antisocial they'd been. The community center you saw earlier is actually part of their rehabilitation initiative. She gestured to another display where former swarm ships had arranged themselves into what appeared to be a public park, complete with quantum-stabilized recreation areas and what looked suspiciously like a tea garden. They're especially keen on demonstrating their commitment to peaceful coexistence, Elena explained. Though we did have to have a small discussion about their initial proposal to apologize by reorganizing the quantum structure of several galaxies. We suggested starting with something more modest, like community service. The council members watched as the display showed various transformed swarm units engaging in what appeared to be volunteer work across multiple star systems, their once terrifying forms now dedicated to tasks ranging from stellar maintenance to quantum environment preservation. And the tea parties? Zixtal found himself asking, unable to quite believe what he was seeing. A wonderful success, Elena beamed. Though we're still working with them on the concept of portion control. They initially tried to serve tea in quantum-shifted space-time pockets that could hold several star systems worth of liquid. We've since helped them understand that most species prefer their beverages in more conventional dimensions. As the council continued to process this information, a notification appeared on the main display. The swarm's newly formed diplomatic corps was requesting permission to make a presentation on their proposed initiative for quantum-enhanced peace and understanding through coordinated reality appreciation. Shall we accept? Elena asked the stunned council members. They've prepared quite a lovely quantum harmonic demonstration, though I should mention they're still quite excited about their new capabilities, so you may want to hold on to something solid when they start their presentation on 11-dimensional community organizing principles. Zixtal, along with the rest of the council, found themselves nodding in agreement, still not quite sure how they had gone from facing an existential threat to discussing proper quantum etiquette with reformed cosmic horrors. But then again, he reflected, watching a group of former swarm ships delicately arranging themselves into what appeared to be an interpretive dance about the importance of dimensional harmony. Perhaps this was simply what happened when humans decided to apply their unique approach to problem-solving. After all, who was he to question a species that had apparently convinced the fabric of reality itself to attend diplomatic functions? To be continued.